Good evening and welcome back to Empty Cloud Monastery. My name is Bhante Suddhāso, and this evening I'll be talking about a very important discourse from the Buddha, the Salayatana Vibhanga Sutta, the analysis of the six senses, which is from the Majjhima Nikaya, Sutta number 137. So I'll read through the discourse and give some explanations as I go along. And then if there's any questions, I'll respond to questions at the end. So please go ahead and type in questions as I go, and I'll take them when I get to the end of the discourse. So we'll start with homage to the Buddha. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Namo tassa bhagavato arahato samma sambuddhassa. Buddhang dhammang sanghang namassami. So as mentioned, this is Majjhima Nikaya 137, Salayatana Vibhanga Sutta. So Salayatana means the six, literally extensions, but ayatana is usually understood to mean domain or dimension. And the six extensions or the six domains is, in this context, it's referring to the six sense fields. So eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So Salayatana, the six sense fields, or the six sensory domains, and vibhanga. The word vibhanga means analysis. Literally, it means breaking apart. So the idea is that in analyzing something, we subdivide it, we break it apart into its component pieces, and we look at each one of those components individually in order to get a proper understanding of the whole. So that's what's going on here. So in analyzing the sensory experience, the Buddha breaks it down into six components: sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought, the six sensory domains. And then he speaks about our experience in relationship to each of those. So I'll go ahead and start reading through the sutta. Discourse begins. Thus have I heard. At one time the Buddha was staying near Savatthi in Jeta's Grove, Anathapindika's monastery. There the Buddha addressed the mendicants. Mendicants, Venerable Sir, they replied. And the Buddha said this: Mendicants, I shall teach you the analysis of the six sense fields. Listen and apply your mind well. I will speak. Yes, Bhante, they replied. And the Buddha said this. He says, and what follows here is the table of contents, effectively. So we see this in a lot of suttas where the Buddha begins by giving a brief summary of what he's about to explain. So effectively a table of contents. So the Buddha says, the six interior sense fields should be understood. The six exterior sense fields should be understood. The six classes of consciousness should be understood. The six classes of contact should be understood. The 18 mental preoccupations should be understood. The 36 positions of sentient beings should be understood. Therein, relying on this, give up that. The Noble One cultivates the establishment of mindfulness in three cases, by virtue of which they are teacher worthy to instruct a group. Of all meditation teachers, it is he that is called the supreme guide for those who wish to train. The Buddha says this is the summary for the analysis of the six sense fields. So in other words, he just gave as I said, he gave the table of contents. And next he'll explain what he means by each one of these statements. So for those who are already familiar with Buddhist doctrine, much of these brief statements that were made will already be clear. You'll already be familiar with the meaning. But for those who are not familiar, the Buddha gives a explanation. So the first one, he said, the six interior sense fields should be understood. And the Buddha says, there are the sense fields of the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So those are called the interior sense fields, or the organs of perception, of sensation. Eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Then he said the six exterior sense fields, which are sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought. So here Bhante Suddhāso translated the last one as ideas, which is, again, mental objects. It's more precise, or mental phenomena. So sight with the eye, ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. Then we are aware of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mental objects. So those are the 6 sensory objects that we become aware of. And elsewhere in the suttas, it's clearly stated that there is nothing outside of these 6 senses. Every single thing we experience fits into one of these 6 sensory fields. Sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mental objects. Next he says the 6 classes of consciousness should be understood. So this refers to eye consciousness, ear consciousness, nose consciousness, tongue consciousness, body consciousness, and mind consciousness. So consciousness in the suttas is most commonly explained as being awareness of a sensory domain, awareness of a sensory field. So eye consciousness means awareness of a visual field, awareness of a visual experience. Ear consciousness means awareness of an auditory field, an auditory experience, and so on. Then the Buddha said the 6 classes of contact. So this is, predictably, eye contact, ear contact, nose contact, tongue contact, body contact, and mind contact. So in other words, when there is a sensory experience through one of these 6 sensory fields, then that is called contact. So sense contact is when the eye comes in contact with a sight, or the ear comes in contact with a sound. So this then is seeing and hearing and smelling and tasting and touching and cognizing. It's when some sensory object enters into a sensory field. Next, the Buddha said the 18 mental preoccupations should be understood. Preoccupation here is a translation of the term pavichara, which can also mean exploration. But preoccupation is actually pretty good here, as will be clear when the Buddha explains what he means. So he says what is meant by the 18 mental preoccupations. So the first one, he says, seeing a sight with the eye, one is preoccupied with a sight that is a basis for elation, or one is preoccupied with a sight that is a basis for depression, or one is preoccupied with a sight that is a basis for equanimity. And he gives the same analysis for hearing, smelling, tasting, touching, and cognizing, a mental phenomena. So for each of the sensory fields, one becomes aware of a sensory object, and that sensory object is related to either as a basis of elation, of happiness, of joy. So maybe it's something that we like, or something that we approve of, or something that reminds us of something that we appreciate, or it's how we think things should be. So we have a positive reaction to it. And the mind becomes preoccupied, it becomes fixated on a sensory experience that we relate to as something to be happy about. Or we become aware of a sensory experience that is a basis for depression, of downheartedness. So again, it might be something painful or irritating or annoying, or something that we think is incorrect or inappropriate, doesn't match up with how we think things should be. So then the mind becomes preoccupied with that. It becomes preoccupied with a sensory experience that we perceive in a negative way, as a basis of disapproval or downheartedness or depression or sadness. Or the third kind of experience is something which we don't have a reaction to one way or the other. So the mind is unbothered one way or the other. The mind doesn't have a reaction of either approval or disapproval, of liking or disliking. So there also one can become preoccupied, one can become fixated, one can start investigating or exploring the experience. So those are the 18 mental preoccupations. So for each one of the 6 sense bases, there's a sensory experience that is a basis for elation, sensory experience that's the basis for depression, and a sensory experience that's the basis for equanimity or neutrality. So then the Buddha goes into the kind of central analysis of this discourse. So he's coming to what's the crux of what he's trying to communicate here. So the Buddha says, the 36 positions of sentient beings should be understood. Now, if you're good with math, and you figured out by now that this is all sets of 6, then you might realize, how do you get from 6 to 36? Anyone? 6 times 6, that's correct. So now we're into 6 sets of 6. So how is this going to play out? Is everybody excited? Is this exciting? I find this exciting. So the 36 positions of sentient beings should be understood. Positions is a bit of an odd word that he's using here. Conditions might be a bit better. Or experiences. The 36 kinds of sensory experiences we can have. So the Buddha says, there are 6 kinds of householder elation and 6 kinds of renunciant elation. There are 6 kinds of householder depression and 6 kinds of renunciant depression. There are 6 kinds of householder equanimity and 6 kinds of renunciant equanimity. That all adds up to 36. In Pali, by the way, so this is Gehasita Somanasa. So Gehasita literally means a person who owns a house, or a person who's fixated on a house. So quite literally householder, which is a lay person. So this is the distinction that's made in the suttas. So in the suttas, there's a very clear understanding that lay people are people who own houses and manage houses and are wrapped up in the affairs of owning and running houses. Whereas the opposite of lay people is renunciants, monastics, which means those who have left behind houses, who are not involved in running houses, who are not involved in managing houses, but instead are living a different kind of life. So here, the word that's being translated as renunciant, so the 6 kinds of renunciant happiness, the word is nekkhamma. So nekkhamma is one of the wholesome states of mind that we cultivate in Buddhist practice. So nekkhamma is letting go of our fixation on things, our desire for things. One moment. Okay, so the Buddha mentioned then the 6 kinds of householder elation, the 6 kinds of renunciant elation, the 6 kinds of householder depression, 6 kinds of renunciant depression, 6 kinds of householder equanimity, and the 6 kinds of renunciant equanimity. So again, the practice of renunciation is the practice ultimately of letting go, of relinquishing. And this, in fact, is the central practice in Buddhism. Ultimately, Buddhism is all about letting go. It's all about relinquishing. Letting go of desire, letting go of aversion, letting go of self-identity, letting go of physical possessions, letting go of attachment to opinions and views, letting go of whatever we think we are or whatever we think we own. And the full manifestation of this is, in fact, in monastic life. In monastic life, one is ideally trying to embody renunciation to the fullest, as completely and clearly as possible. So the distinction that the Buddha is making here is between the reactions that ordinary lay people have to sensory experience versus the reactions that renunciants have to sensory experience. So next the Buddha goes into explaining how this relates to the 6 senses. The first one, he says, In this context, what are the 6 kinds of householder happiness? What Bhante Suddhāso translated as domestic happiness. And he says, there are sights known by the eye, which are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasing, connected with, he says, worldly pleasures of the flesh, which is highly amusing. The Pali is loka misapati sangyutanang. So loka means world, amisa does literally mean flesh, and patisangyutta means connected. And patilabang means acquisition or gain. So acquisition of worldly sensuality. So he says, happiness arises when you regard it as a gain to obtain such sights, or when you recollect sights you formerly obtained that have passed and ceased and perished. Such happiness is called householder happiness. And then the same thing is applied for ear, nose, tongue, body, and mind. So basically, whenever having a sensory experience, if it's something which is desirable and pleasant and connected with worldly sensuality, then the tendency of the ordinary layperson, the ordinary householder, is to be happy about that. They're excited about that. It's like, yay, how wonderful, I'm having a pleasant experience. I'm getting something likable, something sensually pleasant. So the mind then experiences happiness connected with sensual experience. So this very coarse, low, superficial kind of happiness. And by contrast to this, the Buddha says, what are the 6 kinds of renunciant happiness? So the first one is also relating to sight. The Buddha says, when one has understood the impermanence of sights, their perishing, fading away, and cessation, happiness arises as you truly understand through right understanding that both formerly and now, all those sights are impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change. Now, and he says, such happiness is called renunciant happiness. Now, this might be a little bit unclear at the beginning if one does not have an advanced Buddhist practice. It's like, well, wait a minute. How is seeing sensory experience as impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change? How is that a happy experience? And the reason it's happy is because then the mind naturally inclines towards non-attachment. So a sight arises, and whether it's pleasant or unpleasant doesn't actually matter, because we just recognize, oh, this is just another temporary experience. If I react to it, if I fixate on it, if I obsess about it, then I will suffer because it's ultimately unsatisfying. So recognizing the danger, then one does not fall into desire and attachment. One does not fall into emotional reactivity. Rather, one is able to remain aloof from the experience, fully aware of the experience, but not being trapped by it, not getting lost in it. And recognizing the unreliable nature of sensory pleasure, then one does not try to rely on it. One doesn't use it as a basis for happiness once one recognizes that it is not a suitable basis for happiness. Instead, one's happiness is based upon the relinquishment of desire and attachment, which is the only reliable form of happiness to be found. So the renunciant happiness is when we recognize that absolutely every experience is impermanent, unstable, unsatisfying, and unreliable. Therefore, we stop wrapping ourselves up in things which are unsatisfying and unreliable. Instead, the mind finds refuge in non-attachment, which on the other hand is completely satisfying and completely reliable. Something that we can attain in any moment, under any circumstance. And the thing is that when we talk about renunciation or non-attachment, if one hasn't actually experienced it, it might sound a little bit bland. But the actual experience of relinquishment, the actual experience of renunciation, the actual experience of non-attachment is an experience of joy. Joy and safety. So this is what the Buddha calls renunciant happiness. It's the sense of joy and safety that comes when we recognize the impermanence of all things and therefore relinquish our attachment and reactivity regarding those things. So such is called renunciant happiness. So then the Buddha says, what are the 6 kinds of householder depression? Or domestic sadness is how Bhante Suddhāso wrote it here. So again, he says, there are sights known by the eye, which are likable, desirable, agreeable, pleasing, and connected with the world's material delights. He translated it differently in the previous line. I actually think world's material delights is much better than what he had written before. Before he wrote worldly pleasures of the flesh, which is a bit unsatisfying. But again, so it's things which are sensual, so worldly sensuality. So again, there's things which are actually pleasant, worldly sensual experiences. And the Buddha says, sadness arises when one regards it as a loss to lose such sights, or when you recollect sights you formerly lost, that have passed, ceased, and changed. So again, it's actually totally normal to recognize that there are pleasant experiences in the world. But what happens when we lose those experiences? Well, then we get depressed. Or we think about, oh, in the past I used to have such pleasant experiences and now I don't anymore. Oh, how depressing. Oh, my life used to be so much better. So this is a very common experience. We have good times, and then when the good times are over, then we fall into depression, reflecting on how we've lost the pleasant experiences that we used to have. So again, this is the 6 kinds of householder depression, householder sadness. And it's reflecting on how, oh, in the past I used to have more sensual pleasure. I used to have these really pleasant sensual experiences, but I'm not having those experiences anymore. They're over. Oh, how sad and depressing. So this is householder depression. And again, it's this worldly, superficial kind of depression because it's about superficial things. It's about this worldly, superficial desire for sensual pleasure. So then the Buddha speaks about the 6 kinds of renunciant depression. So nekkhamma domanassa, the downheartedness or depression of a renunciant, someone who's abandoned worldly pursuits and committed themselves to the spiritual path. Well, what kind of depression do they have? And the Buddha says, when one has understood the impermanence of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and mental objects, so all 6 senses. So when one has understood the impermanence of sensory experiences, they're perishing, they're fading away, they're cessation. And he says, when one has truly understood through right understanding that both formerly and now, all those sensory experiences are impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change. Upon seeing this, one gives rise to yearning for supreme liberation, thinking, oh, when will I enter and remain in the same attainment that the noble ones enter and remain in? And the Buddha says, when one gives rise to yearning for supreme liberation like this, depression arises because of the yearning. So this is the depression of the renunciant. So it's not about losing one's sensual pleasures, but rather it's about the recognition that one is not yet fully enlightened. It's the pain that comes from this yearning, this powerful desire to attain full awakening, this powerful desire to purge the mind of all of its defilements, this powerful desire to cultivate true wisdom that clearly understands the nature of reality, this powerful yearning to experience the unshakable, irremovable serenity and joy of the fully awakened ones. Again, it's perfectly normal. It's perfectly normal to have experiences which are unsatisfying. And for the ordinary layperson, well, usually the solution is to try to find some more pleasant experiences. You're feeling a bit depressed? Well, you go and watch an interesting movie. or you go and eat some chocolate, or you go and chat with your friends. You try to find some sensual pleasure to perk the mind up and distract it from its sadness. But for the renunciant, there's already the recognition that sensory experiences are ultimately unsatisfying and unreliable. So we know that isn't an option. We know that the only true happiness is found through awakening, through purging the mind of all of its defilements, through cultivating this genuine wisdom of the awakened ones. And yet, if we're being realistic, we look at our own mind, our own heart, and we realize how far we are from that. We look at our heart and we see it's full of desire and aversion. We look at how clouded our mind is with delusion and confusion. And we realize that there is a true happiness, a true safety, a true clarity, and we are far from it. That's depressing. That's a lot more depressing than when your favorite TV show got canceled. That's a lot more depressing than when the store was out of your favorite chocolate. Of course, there's an upside to this, which is it means that one has enough wisdom to recognize that there is genuine happiness. There is genuine wisdom. It is possible. It's a long ways off. So ideally, this renunciant's depression becomes a powerful spur on the path, becomes a powerful goad, a powerful impetus that keeps us moving forward. It's that recognition of like, oh, I really, really want to be enlightened. When am I going to get there? And that can give us this drive of like, okay, I really need to commit myself to this spiritual practice. I really need to cultivate the requisites of awakening. I really need to work on building up the necessary wholesome mental qualities that lay the foundations for awakening. And we just start building that foundation brick by brick. We walk that path step by step, no matter how long it's going to take. It's like, well, it doesn't matter how long it's going to take. We're going to keep doing it, one step after another, because we know that's the only real escape from depression. That's the only real escape from downheartedness. That's the only true happiness, which is the complete purification of the heart through awakening, the complete clarification of the mind through awakening. So then the next is the Buddha talks about the two kinds of equanimity. So the first one is householder equanimity. So the Buddha says, what are the 6 kinds of householder equanimity? The first one, when seeing a sight with the eye, equanimity arises for the unlearned ordinary person. So it says, ordinary person is patujana. Patujana means commoner, ordinary folk. And it's an asuttava patujana. Asuttava means one who has not heard, one who has not heard the Dhamma, one who has not learned the Dhamma. So he says, equanimity arises for the unlearned ordinary person, a foolish ordinary person who has not overcome their limitations and the results of karma, and is blind to the drawbacks. And he says, such equanimity does not transcend the sight. And then the same for hearing a sound with the ear, odor with the nose, flavor with the tongue, touch with the body, an idea with the mind. So one can have a sensory experience and have equanimity arise. But for somebody who lacks wisdom, who does not understand the drawbacks of those experiences, doesn't understand their impermanent and unsatisfying nature, then one might not be having a reaction to the experience, but one is still a slave to one's own craving. So sooner or later, one's craving will arise again, dominate the mind, and inflict torment on the mind. Sooner or later, one's aversion will arise again and inflict torment on the mind. And already one is in a state of confusion. So this equanimity, the householder equanimity, is when one is having an experience and one is not reacting strongly with either desire or aversion, but that non-reaction is arising from a lack of wisdom, a lack of understanding. So rather than equanimity arising from a deep spiritual practice, it's just the equanimity of the fool, the equanimity of the ignoramus. So in this, it's more similar to apathy rather than genuine equanimity. So it's more like, I don't really care about this experience. It's like, well, that's not wisdom. That's not the mind of an awakened being. That's just the mind of an apathetic ignoramus, an apathetic fool. So by contrast, the equanimity of the renunciant, the Buddha says, when one has understood the impermanence of sight, sound, smell, taste, touch, and thought, they're perishing, fading away in cessation, equanimity arises as one truly understands the right understanding that both formerly and now, all those sensory experiences are impermanent, unsatisfying, and subject to change. And he says, such equanimity transcends the sensory experience. And that is why it's called renunciant equanimity. So this is the case where, again, a sensory experience arises, and we recognize the inherently impermanent, unsatisfying, and changeable nature of the experience. And therefore, we do not fall into desire or aversion. And that's not because of apathy, but rather it's because of understanding. It's because of the wisdom which recognizes desire for an experience is only going to cause suffering. Aversion towards an experience only causes suffering. It is only through a clear, non-reactive understanding of the experience that the mind truly becomes free of suffering. So this is the renunciant equanimity. One clearly observes the impermanence of the experience, and therefore one does not fall into reactivity. One does not react with either desire or aversion. And this is what he says transcends sensory experience. It's what allows the mind to transcend samsara entirely and progress towards awakening. So it's the recognition of the impermanence of all sensory experience accompanied with equanimity. So then the next statement the Buddha made, which at first sounds a bit cryptic, the Buddha says, therein, relying on this, give up that. So relying on this, give up that. So he says, by relying and depending on the 6 kinds of renunciant happiness, give up and go beyond the 6 kinds of domestic happiness. So again, the householder happiness, the layperson happiness, it's dependent upon this fixation with worldly pleasure, worldly sensuality. So how does one go beyond that? Well, the Buddha says by relying on the 6 kinds of renunciant happiness. So it's taking joy in observing the impermanence of all sensory experience. It's finding happiness in watching things arise and cease, watching things constantly shift and change. Cultivating a sense of joyful curiosity in observing the ever-shifting nature of experience. So this is a way of finding joy in our practice. It's joy in the observation of impermanence, the observation of the constant change, the fascinating insubstantiality of all experience. Next he says, by relying on the 6 kinds of renunciant depression, give up the 6 kinds of householder depression. So again, the householder depression is when you lose your sensual pleasures, and then you get all depressed and sad because you don't have those pleasant sensual experiences anymore. Well, the recommendation is like, well, okay, you're experiencing suffering because you've lost your sensual pleasure. That's to be understood. Then cultivate a yearning for the only true happiness and safety, which is complete awakening. So rather than trying to seek happiness in unreliable sources, instead seek happiness in the only source that's genuinely reliable, which is spiritual practice leading towards full awakening, the complete relinquishment of desire, aversion, and self-identity. So when one has that depression of like, oh, I've lost my sources of sensual pleasure, well, then it's like, oh, if only I could attain that genuine happiness and peace of the fully awakened ones. And with that kind of yearning, that yearning arising from that, downheartedness of mind, then one aims the mind towards awakening. and starts making progress on the path towards genuine happiness. Then the Buddha says, by relying on the 6 kinds of renunciant equanimity, give up the 6 kinds of householder equanimity. So again, householder equanimity is when one is having a neutral experience, but one lacks the wisdom to understand what's going on. One lacks the wisdom which recognizes the impermanent and unsatisfying nature of those experiences, which means before long the mind will revert to desire and aversion, and therefore will revert to suffering. So when one is having a neutral experience, stay vigilant, pay close attention, observe the impermanent and unreliable nature of all experience. Actually, when you're experiencing a neutral state, that's the ideal circumstance to cultivate equanimity, renunciant equanimity. So wisdom equanimity accompanied by wisdom. Adding in that wisdom component of clearly, impassively observing the impermanent nature of all things. Then the Buddha carries on. He says, by relying on the 6 kinds of renunciant happiness, give up the 6 kinds of renunciant sadness. So again, as mentioned before, there is this depression of the practitioner. It's when we realize how unenlightened we are, and how much we wish we were enlightened, how much we wish we could attain awakening. So that produces this sadness, this downheartedness, when we see how unenlightened we are. Well, in that case, the practice is to cultivate joy, cultivate happiness, happiness connected with the recognition of impermanence, happiness connected with the relinquishment of desire, happiness connected with contentment and mental clarity. And as we cultivate that spiritual happiness, then the yearning for awakening will start to transform. It will start to transform into a joyful progression along the path. And the Buddha says, by relying on the 6 kinds of renunciant equanimity, give up the 6 kinds of renunciant happiness. So of course, happiness is a wonderful thing. Happiness helps to encourage us on the path. It helps to keep us moving forward. But we also want to bring the mind towards a deeper state of serenity and peace. So whatever experience is arising, we don't want to let the mind fall into desire and attachment. So always bringing the mind back to this serene, wise observation of the impermanent nature of all experience. And then the mind is always shifting towards the deepest serenity and the sharpest clarity. Then next the Buddha speaks about different kinds of equanimity. And advance warning, he's about to get into talking about some fairly advanced meditation states, so bear with me. So he says, there's equanimity that is diversified based on diversity, and equanimity that is unified based on unity. What is equanimity based on diversity? There is equanimity towards sight, sound, smell, taste, and touch. So this is equanimity based on diversity. So this means that whatever kind of sensory experience one is having, one cultivates equanimity towards it. One cultivates this non-reactive awareness towards whatever sensory experience is arising. Then he says, what is equanimity based on unity? He says, there's equanimity based on the experience of infinite space, infinite consciousness, nothingness, and neither perception nor non-perception. He says, this is equanimity based on unity. So here the Buddha is talking about the 4 incorporeal or non-physical concentration states. So these are 4 meditation experiences which can happen when the mind is extremely concentrated and stable. Most meditators will never experience these in their life. Especially people who aren't monks. Like the odds of experiencing these, even for monks, is quite low. For lay people, quasi-zero. But the Buddha mentions these because there is this non-reactivity which comes from the mind being so stable and steady and focused that all physical things seem to disappear for a period of time. So that's equanimity based on unity. It's when the mind is completely unified into a concentration so strong that the physical universe completely vanishes. And there seems to be only the interior of one's own mind and nothing else. And so the Buddha says, relying on the equanimity based on unity, give up equanimity based on diversity. That's how it is given up, or that's how it is transcended. So what he's saying here is that, again, with sensory experience, the mind can still be unstable because it's constantly shifting between sight and sound and smell and taste and touch. The mind is constantly moving between different objects. So through cultivating samadhi, cultivating stability and unification of mind, the mind can start to drop that agitated instability. It can start to let go of that tendency to bounce between different sensory experiences. So through cultivating equanimity based on unity, so in other words, through stabilizing and steadying the mind into a state of immobility, then one can experience a much deeper and stronger serenity than just cultivating equanimity as you go through your daily life. Then the next one, the Buddha says, the noble one cultivates the establishment of mindfulness in 3 cases, by virtue of which they are a teacher worthy to instruct a group. And the Buddha says, that's what I said, why did I say it? So he explains these 3 circumstances. He says, the first case is when the teacher teaches Dhamma to their disciples out of kindness and sympathy, saying, this is for your welfare, this is for your happiness. But their disciples don't want to listen. They don't actively listen or try to understand. They proceed, having turned away from the teacher's instruction. I can totally relate to this. Giving Dhamma teachings and nobody pays attention, and then they don't actually apply anything that's been said. This happens all the time. So I actually really appreciate that the Buddha points this out. Just because one is teaching the Dhamma to other people doesn't mean that they're actually going to listen or follow the instructions. So what the Buddha says, in this case, the Tathagata is not unhappy and does not feel unhappiness. He remains unbothered, mindful, and aware. And he says this is the first case in which the noble one cultivates the establishment of mindfulness. So he's saying here that even when one is doing things for the benefit of other people, even if they don't act on it, even if they continue to act foolishly and self-destructively, then one maintains mindfulness of one's own condition, one maintains serenity and non-reactivity, one maintains equanimity in knowing that ultimately we cannot make other people's choices for them. Ultimately, we cannot control other people. Even when we're trying to help other people, we cannot guarantee that they will actually receive our help. So even the Buddha, the person who is the ultimate embodiment of compassion, he cannot actually force other people to attain awakening. Even when he's teaching them, they might not follow his instructions. And there's not anything one can do about that, except maintain one's own equanimity. Then the second case, he says, is when the teacher teaches Dhamma to their disciples out of kindness and sympathy, and some of their disciples don't want to listen, don't actively listen or try to understand, and proceed having turned away from the teacher's instructions. But some of the disciples do want to listen. Some do actively listen and try to understand. Some do not turn away from the teacher's instruction. And it says, in this case, the Tathagata is neither unhappy nor happy. Rejecting both unhappiness and happiness, he remains equanimous, mindful, and aware. So this is the second case. So this again is the case where the Buddha or a teacher, an awakened teacher, is again trying to help people by teaching them the Dhamma. And some take heed and some don't. So here again, the teacher maintains equanimity, mindfulness and awareness, not reacting with either pleasure or displeasure, but just recognizing this is how it is. When you share the Dhamma, some will listen and follow, and some will not. And that's their karma, it's their choice. And the third case is when the teacher teaches the Dhamma, and the disciples do want to listen. They do actively listen and try to understand, and they do not turn away from the teacher's instructions. And interesting here, it says here, in this case, the Tathagata is happy. So he is satisfied, is actually the Pali term here. Attamana means satisfied. So the the awakened one is satisfied and experiences satisfaction. And he is unbothered, mindful, and aware. So this is interesting. So in the cases where the disciples are not following the instructions, then one just practices equanimity, knowing there's nothing you can do, nothing further you can do. But when one teaches the Dhamma, and the disciples actually do pay attention and try to follow the instructions, then one can be satisfied with that. One can appreciate that. And then finally, the Buddha says, of all meditation instructors, it is he that is called the supreme guide for those who wish to train. So again, this is talking about the Buddha. The Buddha is called the Purisa Dhammasarati, the supreme teacher of trainable people. And he says, driven by an elephant trainer, an elephant proceeds in just one direction, east, west, north, or south. Driven by a horse trainer, a horse in training proceeds in just one direction, east, west, north, or south. Driven by an ox trainer, an ox in training proceeds in just one direction, east, west, north, or south. But driven by the Tathagata, the Arhat, the fully awakened Buddha, a person in training proceeds in 8 directions. And again, bear with me, because the Buddha is about to go into some, again, descriptions of very advanced meditation states, which might be a little bit hard to understand at first. So the first one, he says, having physical form, they see physical forms. This is the first direction. Next one, it says, not perceiving physical form internally, they see forms externally. This is the second direction. Third one, they're focused only on beauty. This is the third direction. I'm just going to briefly talk about these first few, and then we'll go into the other ones, because if you think it's confusing now, just wait. It gets even more so. So the first one, having physical form, one sees forms. One way of understanding this is that this is when one is cultivating meditation practice focused on physical mindfulness. So one is fully aware of one's body, and one works on cultivating mindfulness and stabilization through focusing on the body, focusing on one's physical sensation as a way of cultivating mental stability, of cultivating concentration. Then the second one, not perceiving physical form internally, one sees forms externally. So as one proceeds in one's development of one's meditation practice, one can become less fixated on the specific details of one's experience. The mind starts to become increasingly stabilized and unified, which means it's no longer chasing after specific experiences. So one's relationship to physical form starts to settle down, starts to become more peaceful and serene. Then the third one, which says being focused on beauty. There's different ways this is explained. One is that as one's concentration becomes increasingly strong, then this feeling of euphoria, of ecstasy starts to arise. One's relationship to one's physical experience starts to become extremely pleasurable, and the mind becomes elated, extremely joyful, ecstatic. So focusing on that euphoria and joy, then the mind becomes even more deeply immersed into samadhi, even more deeply immersed into concentration. And at this point, one can start to drop the relationship with physicality altogether, once the mind is fully stabilized into deep concentration. But it needs to be understood here. So these first 3 statements are talking about the first 4 jhanas. So when next the Buddha goes into relinquishing the perception of physicality, he's talking about somebody who has already attained the 4th jhana. So if you don't have mastery of the 4 jhanas, don't try to make your body disappear, because that's just cultivating delusion. That's just cultivating mindlessness. The relinquishment of the perception of physicality is for people who have already mastered the 4 jhanas. This is a very important point. I've known a lot of people who think they're to the stage of letting go of the perception of their body, but actually they're not. They're just spacing out and wasting time. So most people are nowhere near this stage in their practice. But because it's in this sutta, I'm going to talk a bit about it anyway. So the fourth direction, it says, going totally beyond perceptions of physicality, with the ending of perceptions of resistance, not focusing on perceptions of diversity, aware that space is infinite, one enters and remains in the experience of infinite space. So again, this is the experience of infinite space, which is the first of the non-physical concentration states. Next one is going beyond the dimension of infinite space, aware that consciousness is infinite, one enters in the experience of infinite consciousness. So it's not actually the case that consciousness is infinite, but rather that it is possible to have an experience in which it seems like consciousness is infinite. So this is, again, just a deeper state of concentration. States of concentration in which there is no experience of body, only the experience of mind. Next it says, going totally beyond the experience of infinite consciousness, thinking there is nothing at all, one enters into the experience of nothingness. So this is, again, the experience where one perceives nothing existing at all. One is awake and aware, and yet there doesn't seem to be anything at all to be aware of, except one's own mind. Then next, the seventh one, says, going beyond the experience of nothingness, one enters the experience of neither perception nor non-perception. So this is said to be a state where the mind is almost asleep and yet not completely asleep. The mind is still awake, and yet in such a subtle, serene state of effective non-functioning that the mind is effectively unaware of its experience. And it's interesting to note that this is, elsewhere in the suttas, the Buddha talks about the four jhanas and the four immaterial states. And it's only this fourth immaterial state in which the Buddha says it is impossible to cultivate wisdom. So in all four jhanas, and in the first three of the non-physical states, the Buddha says it is possible to cultivate insight, to cultivate wisdom. But in this fourth one, the experience of neither perception nor non-perception, the mind is too close to being non-functional. It's so close to being non-functional that it is impossible to cultivate wisdom. And then the final one that's mentioned, it says, going totally beyond the experience of neither perception nor non-perception, one enters and remains in the cessation of perception and feeling. This is the eighth direction. So the cessation of perception and feeling is said to be the closest that a living being can come to experiencing the Nibbana Dhatu, the element of the unconditioned, as close as possible to experiencing absolute reality. So it says, driven by the Tathagata, the Arhat, the fully awakened Buddha, a person in training proceeds in these 8 directions. And it says, this is why it was said, of all meditation teachers, it is he that is called the supreme guide for those who wish to train. This is what the Buddha said. Satisfied, the mendicants approved of what the Buddha said. So that's the end of the sutta. So at this point we can respect the sutta with 3 sadhus, and then I'll see if there's any questions. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. Okay, and hello to the people joining in online. Hello to Manol, Denise, Karuna, Maria, Kristen, Geeta, Julie, Bhumika, Jayanta, Vanessa, Mike, Janaki, Ryushin, Yong, Sud, Joseph, and Victoria. Good to see all of you. And I see a couple questions here. So Joe says, can you speak on the breadth and width of the term sensual pleasure implies? For example, is Mother Teresa finding joy caring for the sick and poor a form of sensual pleasure? So, I would say it's a bit more nuanced than that. So, just, for example, being happy at seeing another person being happy, in and of itself does not lead to awakening. In fact, that can just be another form of attachment. Like, oh, when your friend is happy, then you're happy. When your friend is sad, then you're sad. It's like, well, that's not going to bring you anywhere closer to enlightenment. That just means that your happiness is dependent upon external conditions. On the other hand, if you cultivate kindness and compassion towards others, and you appreciate your own compassion, that will incline the mind towards awakening. So the distinction here is that there one is building one's happiness on the acknowledgement of one's own wholesome mind states, rather than on the external condition of other beings. So you cannot guarantee that you will always be surrounded by happy people or healthy people. So if your happiness depends upon seeing happy and healthy people, then it is unreliable. But you can cultivate wholesome mind states, and cultivating those wholesome mind states will lead to the complete purification of the heart. And that is a reliable way of cultivating wisdom and happiness, a reliable way of bringing the mind towards full awakening. So that's the distinction that I would make. And Victoria says, have you ever heard of meditators that are missing one of their senses, blind, deaf, etc., having an easier time with deep meditation since there is less sensory input to overcome? Well, this is getting dangerous, because if we think that being blind and deaf is good for meditation, then all the meditators are going to start gouging out their eyes and cutting off their ears. And if that was what the Buddha wanted, he would have just told us to do that. So actually in the suttas, I don't see anywhere where the Buddha recommended blindness or deafness. I don't see anywhere where the Buddha recommended sensory deprivation. I don't see anywhere where the Buddha said it's even remotely beneficial or helpful to have sensory deprivation. What we do see is the Buddha saying to, when you see something, relinquish desire and aversion towards what you see. When you hear something, relinquish desire and aversion towards what you hear. When you smell something, relinquish desire and aversion towards what you smell, etc. That's what the Buddha praises. Not cutting off our sensory domains, but rather cutting off our desire and aversion for sensory objects. That's what brings the mind towards awakening. Blindness will not make you awakened. Equanimity towards sights, that will help you attain awakening. So no, I don't think that blindness or deafness or any other sensory impairment will actually help you practice Buddhism. It isn't necessarily an obstacle, but it's not going to be an aid either. So Sud says, I didn't understand the last part at all. Well, I have good news for you, Sud. That's the case for most people. This last section, the 8 directions, is, for most people, absolutely mystifying. Again, because the Buddha is talking about very deep meditation experiences which most people don't have. And he's talking about it in a bit of a different way than he normally does elsewhere in the suttas. So it is in fact a bit mystifying. So again, it's sufficient just to know that through cultivating mindfulness, equanimity, and concentration, the mind becomes increasingly peaceful and still and joyful. And focusing on that stillness and joy, then the mind can enter into deep states of concentration. It can enter into jhana states, which are what the Buddha said is ideal for cultivating wisdom. Actually, in the suttas, the Buddha said the ideal condition for cultivating insight is during 4th jhana. So that's important. It's important to understand that cultivating samadhi, cultivating jhana, is a necessary part of Buddhist practice. And he does talk about the 4 immaterial attainments, but they are not said to be necessary for awakening. Some people might find them helpful, others might not. Others might not go there at all. There's a commonly cited sutta in which there's a group of arhants who have not attained the 4 immaterial attainments, and yet they have attained full liberation. And that's because it seems to be clear in the suttas that the 4 jhanas are sufficient for full awakening. The 4 immaterial attainments do not seem to be required. But it's important to understand what they are. And one of the reasons it's important to understand what they are is because many people experienced one or more of the immaterial attainments and mistakenly believed that that was enlightenment. This was the case of the Buddha's 2 teachers before the Buddha set out on his own. The Buddha had 2 teachers who were teaching the immaterial attainments. And the Buddha attained those experiences and realized, oh, this is not yet enlightenment. These are really incredible experiences, but they're not full enlightenment. There's something higher than this. So it's important to understand the Buddha did explain these, but one reason why they're explained is so that we don't mistake those for the real deal. So you have an experience of nothingness. That's great, good for you. That's not enlightenment. You have an experience of infinite consciousness. That's very beautiful, but it's not enlightenment. It's just another temporary experience. It's a good sign that if your concentration is that strong and you have that little attachment to your body, that you're able to have those immaterial attainments. That's actually a good sign, but it's not yet full enlightenment. It's just a state of mental concentration, which can be used to support your development of insight. But in and of itself, it is not awakening, and it is not even a requisite of awakening. And, so Sud says, does one need actual experience of jhana to really understand what the whole 8-direction thing is all about? So I think, as I mentioned before, the first 3 are talking about jhana, and the rest, the other 5, are talking about the immaterial states. So you only really need to understand how to practice the 4 jhanas. That's sufficient. And Sud says, how does one develop the basic first level jhana, just enough to develop insight? Well, the simple answer is, put your mind on the object and keep it there. That's really it. Another simple way of talking about jhana is hold still, pay attention, enjoy it. Stillness, attention, enjoyment. Those are the 3 ingredients of jhana. Cultivate those 3 and you'll get there. Stillness, attention, enjoyment. And Joseph says, where do the Brahma-viharas fall in this reference of happiness of lay and renunciants? Well, technically equanimity is one of the Brahma-viharas, so you could slot it into that. But I mean, I would just say like this sutta just isn't really talking about the Brahma-viharas. So I could try to shoehorn them in somewhere, but that's kind of missing the point because it's just not what the sutta is talking about. And that's the last question online. You have a question?
Yes, I have 2 questions.
One at a time, please.
The first question has to do with sensual pleasure. And, example you gave is you gave many examples. So, let's say that, you're not feeling great and you decide to watch a movie, but you're making a conscious decision knowing that, it's going to provide temporary relief. Is that any better than doing that unconsciously?
Well, it's always better to do things with awareness and wisdom. So you can think to yourself, I'm about to waste 2 hours of my life cultivating defilements. And then you can do it and watch as your mind becomes increasingly agitated and messy over the course of those 2 hours. And afterwards you can reflect, oh, now my mind is even worse than before. It's even more agitated, even more full of craving, even more full of aversion, even more deluded. So those 2 hours were not just wasted, they were actually counterproductive. So in this way, yes, it can actually be a source of wisdom.
Well, if we're sticking with this example, if I use myself as a personal example, it's usually a movie would be to stop myself from mentally obsessing over whatever I was obsessing. So it's not like the way that I see it is not. It's not that it's causing more defilement, because if I didn't watch the movie, I would just be further down the rabbit hole of whatever I was obsessing over, versus watching a movie and then cutting that
So
obsession.
what I recommend in this case is long periods of chanting.
In
So-
lieu of the movie.
Yeah, long periods of Buddhist chanting. Can also be a great
Right.
time for things like memorizing suttas, studying suttas, memorizing suttas, learning Pali. It's a great thing to do when you're really bored. And you have to be really bored to want to learn Pali. So, yeah, chanting. It's just amazing how much chanting can uplift the mind and also clear away all of those obsessive thoughts.
Right.
Actually, one of the ones that I used to really love, actually, I have to say, this is one thing where I think the Chinese have mastered the art of chanting. Chinese chanting is way more fun than literally everybody else's chanting in the Buddhist world. So I used to be really fond of the Da Bei Jiu. So I had it memorized, I would listen to recordings of it, chant along with it. Really delightful chant.
What is it?
The recitation of great compassion. It's basically a series of praises to Guanyin Bodhisattva. Other ones that work really well are short mantras, shorter or longer. Actually, I've sometimes found longer ones can be better than short ones, depending on the state of the mind. Namo Dabe Guanshi Yin Pusa, Namo Dabe Guanshi Yin Pusa, Namo Dabe Guanshi Yin Pusa. It's just delightful. Like even just doing it 3 times, I can feel my mind softening and brightening. So, yeah, that's actually a much more wholesome way of dealing with obsessive thinking, rather than watching movies, which will just generate even more obsessive thinking.
Why do you think watching movies generates more obsessive thinking?
Watch your own mind and see what happens.
It kind of just for me, I just get sucked into another world, so I'm not dealing with
God, even worse, getting sucked into another world, that's the literal opposite of Buddhist practice. Buddhism starts with the complete clear awareness of this world. The last thing you want to do is get sucked into another world. But it's fine. If you want to justify watching movies, justify it all you want. But watch the mind and watch to see, does the mind then think about the movies afterwards? Does the mind then start wanting to watch movies? Does the mind become increasingly destabilized and unsteady? And you'll see the answer is yes.
that. I can
Yeah, not so good. Whereas if you do, for example, a nice long joyful period of Buddhist chanting, then you'll notice that the mind is bright, alert, joyful, steady, clear, all good things. And it becomes very quiet. The only thing that'll be bouncing around is whatever you've been chanting, which that's a great thing to have bouncing around in your mind. Okay, we have another question online. So Kristen says, if I understand correctly, sense restraint is what should be practiced. Does that mean, for example, upon seeing something that provokes sense desire, we look away or focus on seeing something else? That's one approach. So the standard description the Buddha gave of sense restraint is when seeing a sight with the eye or hearing a sound with the ear, etc. So when having a sensory experience, do not fixate on its features and characteristics, as doing so might cause desire and aversion to invade the mind. In other words, don't fixate on the details that provoke your defilements. So this doesn't mean necessarily that you need to ignore the experience, but rather you need to watch the tendency of the mind to fixate on likable and hateable characteristics, and stop the mind from fixating on those likable and hateable characteristics. And sometimes, yeah, actually the best option is to look away or focus on something else. Sometimes avoidance is in fact the best strategy. We need to be realistic. It's kind of like if you have a dog which eats everything it comes across, well, just keep the food out of its reach. It's probably the better option. So we need to be realistic. We think we're all smart and advanced and stuff. We're not. Most of us are barely above the level of animals. So we need to treat ourselves like animals and train ourselves like animals. And that means sometimes you got to put the food bowl out of reach, so to speak. And yeah, that means sometimes it means looking away from something that's too distracting or too obsessing for you. Okay. You have another question?
Yes. When you were talking about like higher states of meditation that most lay people are not able to achieve and some monks may, what makes it, is it just a product of monks meditating longer, or what makes it easier for monks to potentially achieve those higher meditative states versus a lay person?
Well, because ideally monks are living a life of renunciation. So the more you externally practice renunciation, the more you externally practice letting go and non-attachment, then the more easily you can internally relinquish and let go and not attach. So it's directly related. So monastic life is not actually about meditation. It's about relinquishment. It's about renunciation. It's about letting go. It's about non-attachment. It's not about just meditating a lot.
Why is there a misconception that it's all about not all about meditating, but the bulk of it is about meditating? Or at least that was my misconception.
Because the world is full of delusional people who don't understand Buddhism. That's why. So, these days there's way too much fixation on meditation practice. So meditation is in fact very important. It is in fact a necessary component of the Buddhist path. It is not the central component. It is not the most important component. And it is definitely not the only necessary component.
It's the most important renunciation?
Yes, exactly so. Buddhism is the path of renunciation. That is its core, that is its heart, that is its essence. Meditation practice is to support renunciation practice, not the other way around.
What are you, like the first thing that comes to mind when you talk about renunciation is like renunciation of preferences, because that leads to like aversion and like what you find pleasant. What else are like the top things that you would be renouncing?
Everything. But preference is a great start. Ultimately, what we're trying to let go of is self-identity, attachment to self, self-centeredness, because this is the source of all suffering and all delusion. So that's what we're trying to renounce. And so all of the other renunciations, the more surface level renunciations, are to help us get at the core, the heart, which is self-identity. That's what we really need to get rid of, because that's where all our suffering is coming from. That's the source of all of our confusion and misery. Okay, we have another question online. Vanessa says, is there a good example of how renunciant depression is a catalyst for more spiritual study? How can we prevent this depression from spiraling into upset/pessimism about our ignorance and the world? Yeah, so again, the renunciant depression is when you recognize that you are not awakened, but you want to be. So the important thing here is that it means you know that awakening is possible. And you also know you're not there yet. And you become painfully aware of just how painful it is to be unawakened. So this is why it's a catalyst for spiritual practice. We become aware of how painful it is to be unawakened, and we have the clear awareness that awakening is possible. Not necessarily easy or fast, because it's neither one of those things, but it is possible, and it's worth trying. So this is why that's such a powerful catalyst. And that's the last question, so I think we'll conclude it this time. So we'll go ahead and end now with 3 sadhus. Sadhu, sadhu, sadhu. And we'll see you all next time.